Welcome, everyone, and you are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. We have a repeat offender. That's right. I'm pleased to have again Nick Makar as my guest. He is Senior Vice President, Maritime Administration, Regulatory Affairs at International Registries, Inc., which provides administrative and technical support to the Republic of Marshall Islands Maritime Registry. Nick sits in as part of the important International Maritime Organization Committee, which develops environmental regulations for international shipping on behalf of Marshall Islands delegation to the IMO. And we'll be talking today about his recent experience working on the all-important MEPC session that recently, 80 session that recently concluded. While there has been a ton written about what it means to shipping, this podcast will talk about what it was like in the room. Again, he can't talk about specifics of people and what they said, but he'll give us a feeling of the mood and the excitement, not only leading up to it, but then we're going to talk about what's next. And this is really an opportunity to give everybody, all of our listeners, a way to experience what it's like to be in the arena and not just an armchair manager or an armchair quarterback. Nick, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Chris. I'm really glad to be back on the podcast again.
So MEPC is 80 is done, and everyone's aware of what that means to shipping. But can you walk us through the mood in the room leading up to that event, and especially put it in context for everybody? You had things like Nor shipping. The mood was super, was really good. They talked about a lot of it to do with environment. Did that carry over to what you guys were trying to do, and especially when you first started?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why this was such an exciting meeting, because it was obviously a critical milestone in the work that IMO is undertaking on addressing GHG emissions from shipping. More importantly, I think there was definitely this degree of optimism in the lead up to this meeting. So again, we've had this roadmap since MEPC 70, where an initial strategy was developed and development of these short-term measures, which we talked about last time. And then, of course, the initiation of the work towards revising this initial strategy. So it's not like this sort of all came together out of the blue. There was a considerable degree of work coming together, sort of bringing things towards a focal point. And I think a lot of the excitement and optimism came from basically two areas. One is the fact that, we're coming to this very important milestone, almost like a light at the end of the tunnel. But of course, it's not the end of the tunnel. This is just sort of a lamppost along the way.
Yeah, manhole cover, right? There's a manhole cover. You can come up for air for a little while. I think it's probably a good way to look at it. Yeah.
You're down in the depths of this, and all of a sudden, okay, you can see some sunshine and take a break, almost catch your breath and that sort of thing. Yeah, exactly. But there is obviously a lot more to do, and I guess we can talk about that a little bit more. But the other part, and I think the important part, like you had mentioned about Nor shipping and a lot of the interest in this. The other reason I think there was a lot of optimism coming in is that what we tended to see was a lot of alignment in views. Now, typically there are a whole spectrum of different stakeholders that sort of bring different views into the meeting. And outside of the IMO, on the issue of climate change in general, of course, this is all being developed in a much, much broader context. So there are these obviously very, very clear distinctions of views and things like that. But the main thing, at least with the decisions that needed to be made last week on a revised strategy, what the targets are going to be, what sort of measures are we going to agree on in principle to get us there. There really seems to be a lot of alignment or lining up behind common landing areas. And so from that standpoint, I think there was definitely this view of the probability of success was very high. Now, there was still, of course, many entrenched positions and a number of other red lines and strong viewpoints that still needed to be sort of overcome and worked through. But generally speaking, I think the overall goal there was that everybody was coming together. Everybody wanted to play a part in being part of the solution, and that was sort of one of the one of the differences that we saw that I think really kind of gave a very positive feeling and an exciting feeling coming into it. It did have its difficulties, but leading up to it, it was generally optimistic, I would say.
One of the great things that you talked about, one of my favorite kind of quotes, and to paraphrase, is that sometimes when you have compromise, not everybody's happy. And as you kind of went through this process, did that mood shift and the people became unhappy because they couldn't get what they wanted? Or I know you've mentioned before that UN tries to build on, the IMO and the UN tries to build on a lot of consensus. How did that process work with the idea of getting something out there, needing some compromise? I think you said last time, like I said, not everybody's happy. Were there more smiley faces this time?
Yeah, I think there, we could say that there was a sort of a different definition of compromise here. There was definitely a lot more solidarity and understanding and generally cooperation. So it wasn't a case of sort of a worst case scenario where everybody was unhappy and it seemed like, oh, this is a terrible disaster. Actually, quite the opposite. I think, once the decisions were made, there was this very general feeling of relief, really, and gratitude as well. Like so many different participants and so many different viewpoints were able to move and come to that singular sort of common point. And it took all the way up to the very end of the meeting. And as you say, the mood did change a little bit. We did have a little bit of a slow start getting the working arrangements out. So it was a little bit of a rough start. And also there were some concerns midweek when it didn't seem like things were going to get to where we needed to get to. But as is the usual process and the processes of the IMO and getting the working groups and getting the interested parties together and making sure everybody was heard and finally coming through to that critical breakthrough on Thursday afternoon and hearing and seeing the final text come together unanimously. It was not just relief. It wasn't just a relief, but I think a lot of participants were elated. Really, it was a very good outcome in that sense. So I would say yes. To go back, it was a sort of a different definition of compromise than we talked about last time.
No, that's really interesting. Again, this is kind of the purpose, is to walk people through kind of that mood, right? Because you were relying on reporters and other people. You talked a little bit about, like, there was definitely the high, which sounded like maybe leading up to it and certainly at the end. The low, you kind of hinted a little bit on Wednesday and Thursday morning, maybe, and that seemed to be reported in the press. Can you talk about, like, how did you guys overcome as a group, as a working group? How did you guys overcome kind of the lows of that to get to a point where, as you said, everybody's a little bit more happy, unified text sort of thing at the end? How did you get, can you identify a little bit of where you can? Again, I'm not trying to put you in a tough spot about what the lows were and then how you guys kind of got past that.
I mean, certainly that low point, like I mentioned, was where, there was this possibility of having a divisive outcome. And this gets back to the whole point of compromise and the idea of coming to decisions based on consensus. And I think that's what sort of drove the agreement, was the fact that not just the IMO secretary, but all of the member states, all the participants, again, wanted to be part of the solution and certainly did not want to have a divisive outcome as a result of this. And I think it was the concern that what might be agreed might not satisfy everyone, or even worse, could sort of create this division within the IMO member states. Then I think it was that concern about not having that division in the outcome in order to be able to then proceed with our next steps was really the motivator that got everyone to dig in just a little bit further and reach out just a little bit further and try to understand and identify and see where things can still move and what can we move to then get this to where it can land. And if you don't mind, I mean, just to sort of illustrate that divisive outcome, these things have happened before. And I know I mentioned one, and last time we spoke about, the importance of compromise and having a consensus agreement. That's what the work of all the committees strive for, because obviously you need to have everybody on board when you're talking about introducing legally binding provisions. You really need to have everyone on board. And there's the case when the Chapter 4 of MARPOL Annex 6 was adopted back in 2011. In my recollection, I think that was the only occasion, at least it was the only occasion that I've witnessed where the decision was not made by consensus. Those were the amendments that introduced the EEDI, the Energy Efficiency Design Index, and started Chapter 4 and started all of the energy efficiency regulations under MARPOL Annex 6. Those amendments were actually adopted through a roll call vote, which is part of the process where if the committee doesn't agree to adopt an amendment unanimously, or at least by acclamation or by the majority, it can actually be requested to come down to a vote. The problem there was that because it did come down to a vote, that outcome created a great deal of division among certain member states. And that division made it very, very difficult to proceed with additional requirements and measures and carrying out and undertaking further work addressing GHG emissions until the roadmap was agreed at MEPC 70, and everybody sort of came back on board and began working on the initial strategy and then now the revised strategy and all the requirements you see today.
So that really gets into the crux of kind of having that compromise, because it not only does it kind of, make things easier in the short term, right? And that's what you're kind of, okay, good, we did this. But then the long term, like you said, then you don't have this kind of this schism that you have where, oh, these guys did this. And it could even, devolve even worse where, well, I'm not going to support this one, even though I actually do, I'm going to block it, right? Because you blocked it could get very ugly and political. And again, that's just kind of just looking at, U.S. politics. This is not the podcast for it, but, you see reports of that sort of stuff. So it's really, that's the one thing why I wanted to talk to you, because a lot of people, it's very easy to sit there and to be an armchair quarterback or an armchair manager. But being in the room and having to have that compromise and having to, by the way, continually be in those rooms, not only for this, but for other committees, right? Because you have other committees, whether it's on cargo handling or other aspects of ship safety, port development, you guys got to all still sit in the room together. So you don't want this friction to continue because then it'll slow the body down even more. And I think that to me is something that's why I wanted to have this chat, certainly. One of the things here, was there anything that was a surprise? Did you go, wow, that was a lot faster, that was a lot worse? And again, you could talk in general terms. Was there anything that was a surprise to you?
Well, I don't want to say it wasn't a surprise because I don't have a crystal ball. Nobody knows what was actually going to happen. But again, and I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but I really do think that the best or the biggest surprise or the nicest surprise or the most surprising aspect of the outcome, let's say, was the fact that the revised strategy, that language was agreed unanimously. There were no reservations expressed with respect to any of the provisions in that language. And that gives a very strong foundation for the organization to move forward with its further work. So again, having everybody on board like that, having that level of agreement and recognition and working together was pleasantly surprising, especially when negotiating issues under this particular agenda, which can be very, you can have very polarized views on things.
One thing I do have a question about, and talk about polarizing views. Do you guys have an opportunity to, and again, I'm not talking about like backroom dealing and all this other stuff, but is there an opportunity where you may see another delegate and be like, hey, I could get you that cup of coffee, and you just no, don't try to sell them on your side or her side, but just to try to listen, because one of the most effective things in kind of negotiations, which this is to kind of understand what the black swan event for them is, meaning what is the thing that's happening in their delegation that you could maybe even help solve, right? And a lot of the cards on the table, but there's always that thing. It could be a personality issue. Can we use this slightly different wording here, because then I know I can get the boss man on or the boss woman on or something like that. Is there an opportunity for the delegates to kind of get to know each other and to have that cup of coffee or a glass of wine? And I'm not talking about nefarious stuff. I'm talking about legitimate, like you see somebody walking to a Nero coffee shop. You're like, hey, so-and-so, I'll join you or something like that. Is there that opportunity? Because I'm curious about that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it just could be going off on tangents a little bit in some sense, but I mean, absolutely. That's how this works. And that's why it's so great to be back face to face again. Now I know during COVID we had those setbacks. There was still work being conducted virtually, and there's all these thoughts and theories about the fact that obviously you lose certain dimensions of communication and all that. But that's really definitely the case with the IMO. Certainly, there are hybrid capabilities still available, but for the most part, most of the member states, and you see a lot of the participation, has really jumped back into in-person participation, because you not only have the structured discussions which take place. So the main discussions that take place in plenary, they tend to be very formal. They're based on documents submitted. It's structured according to the agenda and schedule and time frame and terms of reference, which are the instructions that the groups have then when they go forward, and they're working off sort of base texts and things like that. And it's in those realms that the views tend to be a bit insulated, right? This is my delegation's view. This is and everybody's sort of speaking on their own in that sense. There is a degree of coordination that takes place, with among countries, and that you do tend to see play out. But generally speaking, everyone that speaks at the IMO speaks on their own. They speak on their own behalf. Now, when you have the breaks, the meeting times are very controlled. And they allow for long breaks, and you have times like during lunch, or like you say, when you're out getting a coffee, or you're out and about, you have all these people that are there, and of course you're interacting all the time. And the best interactions and the best opportunities to sort of say, okay, you've read our paper, our paper, here's where I'm coming from. Those discussions take place on the margins, as they say. That's during the coffee breaks, during the lunch breaks. And that's why, again, it was so important to be back face to face. And I definitely think that attributed to the outcome a bit, but that's general practice. And that's, as you say, that's negotiation. And so certainly there are opportunities for that.
Yeah, and it sounds like you were able to take advantage of it. And again, it's all about relationships, right? It's in most businesses, but certainly in ours, certainly in an environment like what you're saying, where you have this formal section where you don't step out of line, you say what almost scripted, and then you have the informal. How do we? Well, yeah, I know that this is what the paper said, but what we're trying to get to is this. Okay, well, we're actually not that far apart, because we can come to can come to those terms as well. A little bit of a looking into. You mentioned crystal ball. Nobody knows. So MEPC 80 just got done. Deep sigh of relief. Go on vacation. Forget about all this stuff for a while. What's next for this committee now that you kind of have some of these rules codified and things like that?
Well, actually, and again, it's not to diminish the significance of the decisions that took place last week, but there is a lot of work ahead. So now we're back into that tunnel again, right? So the agreement of the strategy, what you need to remember though is that's really an agreement on where we want to get to. That's a statement of agreement amongst all the member states that this is what we're achieving or what we're aiming to accomplish, what we're looking to achieve. And it's setting targets, it's setting parameters on what needs to be considered when considering those targets, and as well as how to get there. So now that those targets have been set, basically the the bar or has been drawn, or the goalposts have been revised, have been set. We know we have a little bit more clarity on the goalposts now, but now we have to undertake the work on how to get there. And that's where we have the existing short-term measures, the carbon intensity indicator, CII, and EEXI requirements. Those are, it's agreed to undertake a review of those measures. That, again, one of the compromises for those regulations was to review those measures by 2026. So that review process is starting now. Also, in agreeing to the goalposts and agreeing to the strategy, there's also an agreement in principle as far as what the midterm measures from this point forward are going to be to bring us to those points. And that's where you hear about this basket of midterm measures containing a technical and economic measure, working together. So as part of this process, a comprehensive impact assessment of those measures and the impacts of those measures has to be undertaken. And also a timeline was agreed in order to actually develop those measures. So that, again, the strategy to target the actual legally binding text of the measure itself, the regulations itself, still have to be developed. So timelines for the development of those amendments to MARPOL Annex 6, and that's done because that's the most expeditious way to get these new requirements into effect. Those are aimed to be developed and put into the mechanisms for adoption by 2025 and entering into force sometime in 2027. So these are actually very, even though some would have wanted even faster timelines on this, considering the tacit amendment processes of amending MARPOL and again, the way the committee works and the way the IMO works and everything else, this is actually a very, very condensed time frame, because it's not just developing this text, it's also evaluating impacts and also undertaking other work in parallel along with that. So for the next 2-3 years, there's still a considerable amount of work to do, a considerable number of meetings ahead, and plenty of other things we could talk about at future podcasts.
Oh, and we're gonna keep on. You may be the first five-time guest here. We'll have to get you a T-shirt or a hat or something. But one of the things that I think I don't want to lose sight of, and we talked a little bit about it prior to get going, is that these are just the minimums, right? People are going to be concerned about the environment, and they should. But there's always more to do. We had on Salvatore D'Amico back, I think, in the fall. And he talks about, we look at IMO guidelines, whether it's safety or pollution, and we try to do more. And I think we're going to see that, whether it's for altruistic reasons to say they want to be kind of leadership there, or it's going to come from we also talked of the bottom up. In other words, consumers are going to start to demand it. I think there's more visibility there with the container fleet and the car fleet, because that's more, direct end user. But I do think we're not too far off from a time where you're going to have a carbon footprint on every item, and people are going to make part of their decision on maybe paying a little more for a lower carbon footprint. As we start to wrap up here, the question I want to ask you is, what's your takeaway, Nick? I mean, you've been kind of running and gunning with this for a while. You're kind enough to come on here not too shortly after this is all done. What's Nick's takeaway on this?
Well, I guess there would be a few things. One thing I would say is it is a significant outcome, because at least in my view and my understanding, remember, I'm just a simple engineer here. I'm not a a bureaucrat but as a simple engineer looking at this very simplistically, this is absolutely fascinating, because all throughout, and again, looking at sort of broader context, not just IMO, not just shipping, but utilization of energy, and and especially in shipping, utilization of energy has always been driven by, let's say, economy and technological developments, right? It's, you have more efficient systems, better systems, and it's, this is now, it's a fundamentally different thing that's happening right now. The whole decarbonization agenda, it's really driving this change. It's not a change that's sort of happening on its own. So this is a really, really great opportunity for not just the MEPC, not just IMO, but the industry as a whole to really collaborate and lead on a lot of new initiatives and new developments. And so really, again, it's, even though this decision from this revised strategy is only now, it's only part of a step. There's going to be further steps in the future. There's going to be further revisions of the strategy in the future. So it's not sort of this all-encompassing event that happened last week, but it's really exciting because it means that in this whole sort of sphere of thinking, there's a lot of really exciting developments and opportunities to move forward in new ways. And so I think for anyone that's younger in this industry and in this sector, it's got to be a really exciting time, especially seeing this outcome and seeing this sort of unanimity behind the decision to move forward like this and drive this change. And so it's going to be great to see where things go.
I'm excited, and I think you capture something that I ask my guests, and kind of when I do more of my technology-driven podcast is, why should you join this industry? And I think you captured it really well. I mean, whether you're an engineer or even in marketing or just on the business side, there's so much stuff, I guess, for the lack of a better term, whether it's, environmental related, whether it's digital related, but certainly on the environmental side, that's just going to be constantly changing, and again, some people take the negative stance. Well, I want a definitive answer. And yes, to make a capital investment, it's very hard to do given that the goalposts are moving, right? That's certainly something that's difficult to do. And
Understood,
I think, acknowledge that. I think everybody does. But are there things that we can be doing that kind of keeps the ball rolling? 10 years ago, having a sail on a ship, it was like somebody would look at you like you have lobsters growing out of your head. Now, I mean, it is now a very common thing to consider. It may not be a sail as you think it. It could be like a wind kind of a rigid surface type thing. But I remember a few years ago seeing a video about ships in the Baltic, and they kind of have these small rigid sails, and they reduce their fuel bill by 5 to 6%. That's tangible savings, right? So, and I think it's just, you build on that, whether you talk about better lubricating systems for engines, which improve efficiency, better coatings, the whole gamut. And I think that having this shift will maybe even attract kind of big thinkers, right? Maybe people who will be big thinkers, and wow, did you try solving it? So I think that's a great view, and I appreciate you coming on the podcast, and hopefully you get some rest before you got to go back down in the tunnel, Nick. We don't want you to get too burned out here.
Well, I do have some time planned off. I guess the timing of the meeting's good because now we have, we're in the middle of summer and definitely looking to take some time off and enjoy the ocean.
Well, you go ahead and do that, Nick, and once again, thanks for coming on the pod.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Great talking to you again.